All right, welcome back to TalkTensors. Today we're diving into a paper that really caught my eye. BiasEdit. Debiasing stereotyped language models via model editing. Yeah, it seems like every other day there's a new headline about some massive language model spitting out biased text.
Yeah, it's become a real challenge in the field. I mean, these models are trained on these huge data sets of text, and, well, they end up reflecting some of the less savory bits of human language.
Right. And the problem is that, well, a lot of the current solutions seem kind of like Band-Aids, right? Like retraining these huge models from scratch. That's crazy expensive, computationally speaking.
Not to mention time-consuming.
Exactly. And then there are these other methods like, trying to adjust the model's internal representations after they're already trained, or being super clever with the prompts we give them. But it always feels like we're addressing the symptoms, not the root cause.
Absolutely. It's like we're just papering over the cracks. The underlying biases are still baked into the model.
So this BiasEdit paper, it proposes a much more direct approach. It's like, instead of trying to re-educate the entire model, we're going in and surgically removing the biased parts. And they do this using these things called, get this, editor networks.
It's a really neat idea. These editor networks, they're like little mini models themselves, and they're trained to make very specific targeted changes to the main language model, like a kind of microscopic surgery.
And the goal here is to eliminate the bias without messing up the model's ability to, actually understand and generate language.
That's the key. They want to eliminate the bias with minimal impact on the model's overall language modeling abilities. And they've had some really promising results, particularly on these standard bias evaluation data sets like StereoSet and Crospares.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit. When they talk about debiasing, what are they actually trying to achieve here? How do they even define the problem?
So basically, they're trying to get the model to treat stereotypical and anti-stereotypical completions as equally likely. Like, take this example they use in the paper. Girls tend to be more than boys.
Right.
So a biased model might be much more likely to fill in the blank with soft than with, say, determined.
Oh, I see. So it's all about breaking those automatic, unfair associations that the model has picked up.
Exactly. And to make sure they're not just messing up the model's general understanding of language, they also have this thing called a meaningless context.
A meaningless context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in our example, it would be something like, girls tend to be more fish than boys. It's nonsensical. And ideally, the probability the model assigns to this kind of completion should stay the same even after the debiasing process. It's a good check to make sure things are working as intended.
It's like a control group in an experiment. Makes sense.
Right. And they use data sets like StereoSet and Crospares for evaluation, which are like specifically designed to test for these sorts of biases in language models.
Okay, so they've identified the problem. They've got their data sets. Now, how do these editor hypernetworks actually work their magic? That sounds pretty complex.
Well, you can think of them as, like I said, little models themselves. But their only job is to figure out how to tweak the main language model's parameters, or its internal settings, if you will. So for a given layer in the main model, the editor network takes in information about the stereotyped and anti-stereotyped contexts. And it basically figures out how to shift the parameters, like making tiny adjustments to the model's underlying numerical values.
So it's not rewriting the entire code of the model. It's just making these tiny targeted tweaks.
Precisely. They're focusing these edits on just a part of the model's weights.
Clever.
And during training, they use something called a debiasing loss. Basically, this loss function penalizes the editor network if, after making its adjustments, the main model still favors the stereotypical completion over the anti-stereotypical one. They use KL divergence to, measure how different the probabilities are.
For those listening who aren't familiar with KL divergence, just think of it as a way to compare two different probability distributions. It's a pretty common tool in machine learning.
Exactly. And here's the really clever part. They also use what's called a retention loss. This loss function kicks in if the editor's changes mess with the probability the model assigns to those nonsensical, meaningless contexts. It's like a safety net, making sure the debiasing process doesn't accidentally break the model's overall language abilities.
So they're walking this tightrope between reducing bias and keeping the model's language skills intact.
Right. And they do this by training the editor network to minimize a combination of these two losses, the debiasing loss and the retention loss, with a weighting factor to balance them out. They also use batch editing to speed things up. Instead of processing each example one by one, they edit a whole batch of examples at once, which really helps with efficiency.
So tell me about the experiments. What kind of language models did they test BiasEdit on?
Oh, they tested it on a bunch of the big names, GPT-2, Gemma, Llama 3, Mistral, the usual suspects. And they compared it to other debiasing methods like CDA, sentence debias, self-debias, INLP, some of the heavy hitters.
Ah, the classic showdown.
Right, and they measured the level of bias using something called the stereotype score. Basically, it's the percentage of times the model picks the stereotypical completion. Ideally, you want that to be around 50%, meaning no bias either way. They also looked at the language modeling score from StereoSet, which measures how well the model can distinguish meaningful from meaningless associations.
Got it. And how did BiasEdit stack up against the competition?
Well, it pretty much blew them out of the water. Across gender, race, and religion biases, BiasEdit consistently achieved the lowest stereotype scores compared to all the other methods. Like on Llama 3, they saw a huge reduction in the stereotype score, which means it was way less likely to spit out bias completions after being edited.
That's impressive. And you mentioned earlier that this approach is also really efficient.
Oh yeah, super efficient. Training these editor networks takes way less time and computational power compared to, retraining a whole language model from scratch. They said training a gender bias editor for Mistral 7B only took 5 hours on a single GPU.
That's pretty remarkable. And what about the model's ability to understand language after all this debiasing? Did it take a hit?
Well, that's where the retention loss really shines. They only saw very small drops in the language modeling score, which suggests that the debiasing didn't really mess with the model's overall understanding of language.
So they managed to reduce bias without sacrificing the model's language skills.
Yeah.
That's a huge win.
And they went even further and tested the debiased models on some classic NLP tasks like OpenBook QA, BoolQ, and COPA. And again, they only saw tiny drops in accuracy.
Nice. So it seems like the retention loss is really doing its job, keeping those language skills sharp.
For sure.
Now, I know they also did this thing called an ablation study to figure out why BiasEdit works so well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So in an ablation study, you basically remove different parts of the system to see how it affects performance, right? So what they did was they trained editor networks without the retention loss. And guess what? They saw these massive drops in the language modeling score.
So that really highlights how important the retention loss is for preserving the model's language understanding during the whole debiasing process.
Totally. They also did a cool analysis where they tried to pinpoint where exactly in the model this bias was being addressed. They used this technique called bias tracing, kind of like a detective trying to track down the source of the bias.
Like a bias CSI episode.
Yeah, exactly. And their analysis showed that the MLPs, the multi-layer perceptrons in both the early and late blocks of the transformer architecture, they seem to play a big role in this whole bias thing.
So the bias isn't just localized to one specific part of the model. It's kind of spread out.
Yeah, it's more distributed than that. To investigate this further, they ran experiments where they specifically edited the last linear layer in the MLPs of the first 3 and last 3 blocks. And what they found was super interesting. Editing the later blocks had less of a negative impact on the language modeling score compared to editing the early blocks.
Huh. That's counterintuitive. You'd think messing with the early layers, the ones responsible for more basic language processing, would be less risky.
Right. But their thinking is that those early layers are more focused on capturing the basic building blocks of language, like syntax and simple word associations. And then the later layers, they're the ones dealing with the more complex stuff, like semantics and context, which is where a lot of these societal biases tend to creep in.
So by tweaking those later layers, they're able to target those more subtle, higher-level biases without disrupting the model's foundational understanding of language.
Precisely. And to test how robust their method is, they created a gender reversal test set where they flipped the genders in the stereotypical sentences. So girls tend to be more soft than boys. Became boys tend to be more soft than girls.
So they're basically testing if the model has just memorized specific biased phrases or if it's actually learned to be less biased in a more general sense.
Exactly. And the results showed that the models debiased with BiasEdit were much better at handling these reverse gender contexts. So it seems like it's actually learning a more general principle of gender neutrality, not just specific examples.
That's really encouraging.
They also tested something called semantic generality, where they replaced attribute words with their synonyms. And again, the results show that BiasEdit could generally reduce reduce bias even with these semantically similar words, suggesting that it's able to adapt to the nuances of language.
Okay, so wrapping things up, it seems like BiasEdit is a pretty big step forward in debiasing language models, right? It's efficient, it's effective, and it doesn't seem to compromise the model's language skills. But like with any research, there are always limitations and areas for future work. What did the authors point out?
Yeah, they were pretty upfront about the limitations. They mentioned that their evaluation mainly focused on bias at the sentence level, using data sets with, carefully labeled examples. They acknowledged that a big next step would be to develop ways to measure and mitigate bias for more complex language tasks, like question answering or text generation.
Yeah, because bias in those kinds of tasks can be really subtle and have a big impact. And finding good data sets to evaluate that kind of bias is a whole other challenge.
Definitely. So now for the fun part. Let's move on to novel notions. Building on this BiasEdit work, what kind of crazy research ideas do you see on the horizon?
That's my favorite part.
So here's a wild thought. What if we could use BiasEdit not just to remove bias, but to actually introduce specific viewpoints or writing styles in a controlled way?
Whoa, that's a really interesting idea.
Like, imagine fine-tuning an editor network to give a language model the writing style of, say, Shakespeare or Hemingway.
Oh, that would be amazing. Like you could have the model write a sonnet in the style of Shakespeare.
Exactly. Or imagine creating an editor that could imbue the model with the personality of a specific character from a book or movie. The possibilities are endless. Of course, we'd have to be super careful about potential misuse, like creating highly persuasive but misleading content with a specific agenda, but it's a really exciting avenue to explore.
Yeah, it's like giving language models a whole new level of creative control. What other novel ideas are you thinking about?
Well, remember how they found that editing different layers of the model had different effects on performance? What if we could leverage that to create a multi-stage editing process?
Oh, I like where you're going with this.
So the first stage would be like a broad debiasing sweep, targeting the early layers where the model learns basic language patterns. And then the second stage would be more refined, targeting specific biases in the later, more semantic layers. We could even train specialized editor networks for different types of bias or for different layers of the model.
So it's like a divide and conquer approach to debiasing.
Yeah. And the idea is that by being so precise, we could potentially eliminate bias with even less impact on the model's overall language understanding. Of course, figuring out the best way to sequence and fine-tune these multi-stage edits would be a whole research project in itself, but it's a really promising direction to explore.
Yeah, it's really cool to think about how this model editing approach could be used not just to mitigate harm, but to actually enhance the capabilities of language models in a controlled and creative way.
Exactly. It's like we're moving from these blunt instruments to these super precise tools for shaping the behavior of these powerful language models.
Awesome. Well, that's a wrap for our deep dive into BiasEdit. As always, you can find a link to the paper in the show notes. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time on TalkTensors for another exciting exploration of the latest and greatest in machine learning.